Hey internets. So in the last year or so, I've noticed that more and more people are being outspoken and standing up against the equal outcomes equals discrimination argument. You know, the typical woke scold idea that if you see a disparate outcome or an unequal outcome between two groups, then that must mean that some kind of discrimination must have happened against one of those groups. Which then dredges up some very silly and obviously incorrect takes like different ethnic groups get different test scores on geometry exams in high school, therefore math is racist. Or women have a harder time passing physical exams for the army, therefore the military is sexist, or sometimes just the good old-fashioned capitalism has had unequal outcomes, therefore the adoption of communism is necessary to resolve the disparities, etc., etc. Also known as the equity fallacy, as I like to call it. And in this video, I'm going to point out a very big thing that a lot of people are misunderstanding about it, especially people on the right, actually. You see, the biggest problem with the equity fallacy isn't so much when it is wrong, or in other words, when the unequal outcome is not due to discrimination or some kind of unjust or unfair thing that happened. Because that's what I see most people focusing on when they criticize the ideology of wokeness. For example, on Twitter, I've noticed a big resurgence on the focus on the HBD hypothesis, which TLDR, their hypothesis is that the differences between groups is largely due to genetics, which may have some truth to it. However, I think it's missing a much bigger part of the picture, which is that the biggest problem with the equity fallacy is actually when they are right, when the wokes are actually correct about the inequalities being the result of some kind of failure of justice. There is in fact an even bigger flaw in their reasoning that they run into even when they're right on the basics. And in this video, I'm going to explain what this flaw in reasoning that stands next to the equity fallacy is. Because it's a very interesting flaw. It's a fairly well-known one, but it's also one that is poorly understood, and thus most people are not talking about it. And it's something known as the streetlight effect, not to be confused with the spotlight effect. Very different fallacy. No, I'm talking about the streetlight effect. If you have not heard of this one before, it kind of goes like this. Imagine in the middle of the night, you see a drunkard under a streetlight. He's kind of bumbling about like a fool, feeling around on the ground, like he's looking for something. And so a security officer comes out and tries to see if he can help them. Sir, what is going on? Did you lose something? And the drunkard looks up at the officer in all of his stupor. Well, yes, I lost my keys. And so then the security officer looks around the streetlight and notices that he immediately doesn't see any keys anywhere. And so he asks the obvious question. Okay, well, is this where you lost your keys? To which the drunkard then, in all of his glorious stupor, once again looks up and replies, no, I lost my keys somewhere around the parking lot. But this is where the light is. And so it's easier to look around here. And so that's why I'm here. Now, looking at this from the outside in, just about any reasonable person can spot the obvious problem here. The drunkard is obviously never going to find his keys under the streetlight if said streetlight is nowhere near where he dropped his keys. But the drunkard and his poor little alcohol-drowned brain is just unable to comprehend that. He's just not in a state of mind where he can put the obvious two and two together and realize that he is completely wasting his time, along with the time of anybody else who's trying to help him. And that in essence is what the streetlight effect is. It's this tendency to look for solutions to problems in places where it is easier to find those solutions, as opposed to the more difficult task of seriously attempting to understand things at their root cause, or look for solutions in harder to reach places, even if those solutions may be more effective. And in the context of a drunkard stumbling around for his keys under the streetlight when it's obvious he's never going to find them there, well, it's easy to look at that and laugh, and think that there's no way an educated, intelligent, sober person would ever make this mistake. But you'd be very surprised, because of course this example of the streetlight effect puts you in the perspective of the outside observer, because in this hypothetical, the root cause of the problem is very obvious, and so no real investigation is necessary. But in the real world, a lot of times it's not so obvious and investigation is necessary, and yet people stumble around for solutions under the streetlight anyway. Getting back on track to how this pertains to the equity fallacy and the neo-Marxist woke movement, here's a more complicated scenario. Say a man is going to the bank and he gets robbed, and let's just say that was all of his money. So what do we have here? Well, we have an injustice. He had money, but it was unfairly stolen from him. Pretty simple, right? And so the next day, this man goes to the store and tries to buy some food, and tells his story to the cashier, begging for basically free food. And so the cashier responds to him, well, okay, I'm sorry what happened to you, sir, but we're not allowed to just give our products away for free. We would go out of business if we did that for everyone. Okay, so what's the point here? Well, the story becomes a little bit more interesting when you start asking yourself some philosophical and ethical questions, such as, should the grocery store clerk be obligated to give this man groceries for free simply because a bad thing happened to him? And while it would be nice of him to do that, the answer in terms of maintaining a stable society with a stable economy, you kinda have to say no, because you're blaming the wrong person. It just happens to be an easier solution in the heat of the moment. Or in other words, the streetlight is on the man at the checkout stand here. But really, the correct solution isn't to put the grocery store clerk into some kind of moral quandary. The correct solution, obviously, would be to find the robber and punish the robber and return the man's money back. Again, looking from the outside in, this is kind of obvious. But what if it wasn't obvious? What if I didn't tell you the first part of this story? In fact, what if you were a bureaucrat just looking at this on a spreadsheet, and you noticed that, hey, the store successfully sold groceries to these people, but then couldn't give their groceries to these people because these people were unable to afford them. And then you tallied up and found the people who were unable to afford the groceries disproportionately come from a certain area of town. And let's just say that that area of town is disproportionately of a high certain percentage of a certain ethnic group. And so then the bureaucrat concludes that the store is systemically discriminating against that group and starts to push for policies that would require the grocery store chain to sell food to that group at a reduced price. With the result being that the grocery store inevitably just ends up closing up shop and moving to a city that is not run by complete blithering midwits. This may all sound a bit insane, but it is exactly the problem I'm talking about here in why even when they're correct with the equity fallacy, they can still be horribly wrong and run into a brick wall as a result of the streetlight effect and not really attempting to understand problems at the root cause. Because this is actually, sadly enough, not an unrealistic hypothetical. Things like this have actually happened, where those in political power will shift the responsibility of fixing an area's crime problem to privately owned stores that have nothing to do with the cause of the problem. And of course, it doesn't work because, as it turns out, being wrong about things, even if you're right about certain things, if you're wrong about the big picture and you try to find a solution under the streetlight when the solution is not there, well then being wrong is still going to have consequences. The bureaucrat could be right that these people are facing some kind of systemic unfairness, but if they're looking for it at the grocery store instead of out where they're more likely to find it, well then obviously they're doomed to fail. And it's more than just the grocery store question where woke toys will run into this problem. Like for example, going back to take that math is racist, because certain ethnic groups don't do as well in math at school. And just for the sake of simple argument, let's assume that the HBD hypothesis or similar explanations of genetics are wrong here. Let's just pretend that the real reason behind IQ differences between ethnic groups is entirely due to lead poison. I'm not saying that I know for sure that that is the root cause, but for the sake of the point here, let's just pretend that it is for the rest of the video. Let's just pretend that all differences between all ethnic groups and population groups of some sort are due to IQ differences that are entirely explained by lead poisoning. And thus the basic assumption of the equity fallacy in this particular context is therefore correct. The root cause of the unequal outcome is in fact due to some kind of environmental injustice. Okay, but that then just ultimately brings us back to square one of this question. Is math racist? No, of course not. Math is absolutely not racist. If you ask any woke toy to explain to you how exactly, very specifically, math is racist, such as what specific laws of mathematics that are being taught are inherently discriminatory, they will of course not be able to give you an answer, because they have absolutely no idea. They're just looking at the outcome. And in this particular hypothetical scenario, they're never going to find a solution to the problem by saying that math is racist, because the solution cannot be found in the classroom. We would have to actually look at the root cause of the lead poisoning and find an answer to why it's happening, and stop it there. No amount of tomfoolery in the classroom and shifting rules around in education is going to fix the problem. It's only going to just create other secondary effects. Like one specifically I've noticed is that saying math is racist, well, that doesn't reduce feelings of racism in the population at large at all. If anything, I've noticed it just makes racism worse, because it's just obviously wrong. But the problem is that a lot of times these neo-Marxists happen to be on the boards of education, and thus they look for a solution to the problem within their scope of education. Just like the drunkard bumbling around for his keys under the streetlight when that's not where he lost his keys. And so you have the same problem. They find stupid solutions to the problem because it's not the root of the problem. They do things like reducing the testing requirements of math classes in order to make the curriculum easier. And so thus all the kids can pass it equally. Or you get other silly solutions like the No Child Left Behind Act, which has good intentions, but ultimately falls flat because again, it's not looking at the root cause of the problem. With the ultimate sad secondary effect of looking for these solutions in easy places being something that makes everything worse. Because while reducing the difficulty and lowering standards may make for some more equal outcomes, it does so at the expense of making everyone overall less competent. And you can find similar examples in the problem of fixing behaviors. For instance, imagine a school with 1,000 students, and for the sake of argument, let's just say that they have a 25% even split between 4 different ethnic groups. We'll just call them red, green, yellow, and blue. These of course are not real groups, and you're not going to find a school that has a perfect 4-way split in terms of its population like this, but for the sake of simplicity, let's just roll with it. Now, in this school district, one of the overlords notices a problem, which is despite having an even representation in terms of population, or the school's total demographics, the same split is not represented in the demographics of the detention hall, where they find that students experiencing this kind of disciplinary action, at the end of the week, the detention hall is a more 50-30-15-5 split, with an average 20 students finding themselves in detention per week, with 10 of the students being red students, 6 of them being green students, 3 blue students, and 1 final student on average belonging to the yellow group. And they see this pattern repeated constantly over multiple weeks of the school year, over multiple years, over multiple decades. And so the person investigating this sounds the woke alarm. Clearly, as a result of this unequal outcome, the faculty must be discriminating against the red students and punishing them at a disproportionate rate, due to them having implicit bias. And once again, for the sake of argument, let's just keep with the previous assumptions of the previous hypothetical. Let's assume that the root cause of the difference is IQ, resulting in red and green students making poor decisions and engaging in more destructive behavior on average, and let's just say that the reason for this IQ disparity is entirely due to lead poisoning, and thus the root assumption of the equity fallacy is correct. The reason why they are experiencing this disparate outcome is, at its root cause, a form of injustice. But yet, through the magic of the streetlight effect, this board member who notices disparity doesn't look for the solutions to this problem at their root cause. Instead, they look under the streetlight of what they can fix within the school, and they assume that they're going to find the solution to the problem within the school faculty, and so thus they falsely assert that the faculty is being prejudiced. And so, of course, in order to fix the disparity, they implement a quota-based policy, where the demographic percentage representation of the detention hall must now match the 25% even split of the overall campus demographics, with the additional proposed solution being that if the faculty that is in charge of enforcing disciplinary action fails to meet this goal, then they will be fired and replaced. Now, of course, what is going to happen in this scenario? Well, the answer is obvious. The faculty doesn't want to lose their job over something that's stupid, and so what they end up doing is they just kind of end up looking the other way when the red students do something wrong, while being increasingly strict on blue and yellow students. Because of course, this solution is very stupid. It doesn't actually touch on the root cause of the problem, because it refused to even entertain the possibility that red and green students were simply misbehaving at a disproportionately higher rate. Not just because that would be morally unthinkable to them, but also because that solution just wasn't under the streetlight. It wasn't within their grasp, and so they came up with this band-aid solution, with the net effect, sadly, being increased ethnic strife. Because of course, the students of this school are absolutely going to notice. They're going to see the result of this policy being that red students can just basically do whatever the heck they want and get away with it half the time, because they're no longer allowed to be effectively punished for it, which could potentially even create a negative feedback loop where the red students notice this and misbehave even more because they notice they can get away with it more. The school then doubles down on their equity policies, and then the red students notice that they can get away with even more bad behavior, and so then the school triples down, and round it goes. And all of it is sadly due to the streetlight effect. They refuse to take on the more difficult task of seriously attempting to understand the problem and look for a solution to the problem at its root cause. And to some degree, I can kind of understand why the neo-Marxists do this. We as individuals all have limited power. Even the President of the United States can only do so much, because power in the modern world is much more bureaucratic. It's not exactly top-down. And so what happens is we see people reaching for the levers of power that are within their grasp, and pulling that lever to fix a problem, even when it's obviously not the right lever. And then people act confused when it creates even more problems. And the issue here is that people seem to not understand that they can be correct about the general idea of a problem, but being horribly wrong about the specific details can have some very major consequences. And people just don't think of those consequences. I mean, it's easy to understand them when, again, looking at the simple scenario of a drunk looking around and under the streetlight for his keys, with the consequence being that he's just never going to find his keys. But in more complex social issues, things are not so simple, and so people reach for that lever anyway, and are then dumbfounded when things just keep getting worse. And that is why the streetlight effect stands adjacent to the equity fallacy, and how both of them together have the West currently running towards a brick wall. In the past 60 years or so, the neoliberal promise of equality has led to bureaucrats and intellectual elites reaching for all kinds of knobs and levers of power that are within their grasp, under the equity fallacy assumption that the inequalities are due to discrimination and injustice. And the bulk of the debate against this behavior is largely focused on the equity fallacy being wrong. But the streetlight effect shows us how even when the equity fallacy is right, that does doesn't mean that they've found the root cause of the problem. So going back to the school with the four-way split, the only real long-term non-band-aid solution to this would be midwits swallowing their pride and accepting the fact that there's nothing within their grasp that they can do. They like to assume that it's not just red students misbehaving at a disproportionate rate, because that just yanks the solution away from their streetlight, leading to a much more complex solution where in this case they would have to look at the IQ differences, figure out what's actually causing them, and then in this case, since we're assuming it's lead poisoning, finding a way to reverse or stop the lead poisoning. But of course, that's actually difficult to do. And it also brings up the moral quandary, kind of going back to the question of the clerk and the guy who got robbed. Is the clerk morally obligated to give that guy his food for free? And the answer really is no, for a very simple reason. It's not his fault. And coming back to the real world, in the last 15 years or so, where it's largely been the ideology of wokeness that has been in charge of our intellectual institutions, I've noticed they really don't want to look at things from this perspective, because that requires them to do one of two things that they really don't want to do. The first of these would be accepting the fact that us crazy libertarians were right all along, that their attempt to band-aid fix inequalities with a bunch of random rules and regulations, simply because that's within their grasp of the levers of power that they have, is not actually a good fix for inequality. Restricting people's freedoms through either quotas or other kind of regulations or other various restrictions on the market just for the sake of equality largely just doesn't work. It just results in the market being inefficient, which results in widespread systemic failure, which would also force them to accept the fact that they've been guilty of the streetlight effect bias in a lot of other manners other than just wokeness. Take Pizza Cake, for example, a relatively well-known and very intelligent comic artist, who despite what some people may think does in fact have an IQ higher than a pineapple, because I mean, look at this brilliant comic right here. Today we're gonna learn about insurance. Hey insurance, I am injured and need some of that money to give you in case I get injured. No, and that's how insurance works. Brilliant, ingenious. Okay, seriously though, this is actually a fantastic example of the streetlight effect. A lot of people, when they're complaining about the high cost of healthcare in, say, the United States, they are often looking under the streetlight of their insurance bill, instead of understanding things at a deeper level. Because in reality, when you actually start to understand things, you'll realize that the reason insurance is so expensive is due to various second, third, and fourth order effects, which is mostly a subject for another video, but the main one just comes down to the fact that regulations in the United States create these unnatural monopolies, which are then able to charge whatever they want for medical supplies, which increases the cost of healthcare, and since insurance helps cover that cost, well then naturally insurance premiums are going to be high because of the problems behind why healthcare is so expensive. But of course that requires a much more sophisticated understanding of the root cause behind the economic issues that are plaguing the medical industry as a whole. But hey, you see your insurance premiums are high, and your copays are high, and your deductible sucks, and it's easier to just blame it on that. And yeah, there's some pedantic correctness in this one. It's true that insurance companies also often have unnatural monopolies, and they will often try to find loopholes to get out of paying for what they promised. However, blaming it all on them is an oversimplification, but it's easier to find the problem in that area, and so that's where people look for it. For instance, someone may go for a week-long hospital stay for some infection or injury or something, and the bill will come out to something completely ridiculous, like $50,000. And then their insurance company will pay 90% of it, leaving them with a $5,000 bill, and they go, oh my god, these greedy insurance companies, why are they making me pay $5,000? And then of course the eternal midwit will make no attempt whatsoever to understand the inner workings behind why the original price was $50,000. They just look at their bill and go, ugh, greedy insurance, despite the fact that it's just one part of a much more complex problem, but that's where the streetlight is. And so that is the extent of their understanding. And libertarians have really been calling this out for a very long time. We just usually haven't been calling it the streetlight effect. A ridiculously massive number of bad neo-Marxist take on the economy are entirely due to people blaming what is easy to blame within their line of sight, and just completely ignoring the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the reason for why certain thing costs so much is actually due to something that happened 5 steps back in the pipeline. And yet they don't bother to check because that requires them looking at the entire pipeline and actually understanding it, and nobody wants to do that kind of work. For the same reason that the drunkard doesn't want to look for his keys in the dark of night where the weebles lurk. And then the second possibility that, again, the wokes really don't want to do is, aside from engaging with us libertarians in good faith, another thing they really don't want to do is engage the HBD crowd in good faith. Because, you know, making sure that they're censored and shadow banned and demonetized and deplatformed all the way to the 9th layer of hell has been working out so well for them them in the past. But the problem is none of them want to really ask the question of whether or not that's really sustainable. And I don't think it is, even if they do manage to defeat the geneticists in good faith. The leftist take on equity and their proposed solutions are still doomed no matter what. Their tendency to blame the causes of the inequities on general problems around the vicinity of the streetlight or where they encounter the problem simply because it's easier to find a solution where they can make a solution happen, instead of any good faith attempt to truly understand the root of the issue. It comes with the inevitable consequences of wasting time, energy, and on a societal scale, billions if not trillions of dollars, all on basically not fixing the problem. The band-aid fixes they propose are really the equivalent of if the security officer, in the standard streetlight effect example with the drunkard, decided to take pity on the drunkard and just pay for a locksmith to help the poor guy just get a new set of keys, which might help that specific drunkard and may appear to fix the problem. But what if we're talking millions of drunkards, constantly coming out doing this all the time under millions of streetlights? Because of course, once we scale things up to society, we have to start asking ourselves, okay, is this an actual real long-term solution? And the reality is, unless you really get to the root of the problem, most of the time it's not a long-term solution, because it's just not economically efficient. And yet I see our intellectual elites who are knee-deep in the cathedral of the Church of Equality constantly reaching for the lever that's within their grasp anyways. And what do these woke scolds have to show for themselves? Donald freaking Trump getting elected for the second time. Good job, midwits. Good job. Slow freaking clap there. But seriously though, my point here is that there's a lot of liberal intellectuals out there who really desperately need to spend some time in front of the mirror and accept the hard fact that the past century of civil rights madness has not produced the results they desire. And no, it's not because they didn't try hard enough, but because they were wrong from the very beginning when they oversimplified things to thinking that if they just blamed inequalities on discrimination and injustice, then that would mean that they can fix things. It doesn't mean that. Fixing things requires more than just being right about there being a problem. You also have to give a good faith and rigorous attempt to identify the specific cause. Otherwise, you're just going to tie society up with a bunch of bureaucracy and red tape that will ultimately prove ineffective. What we have seen instead is these people taking for granted the fact that discrimination as a cause is largely unfalsifiable in order to keep their solutions within the scope of the streetlight. Because it's of course impossible for someone to prove that they are not prejudiced, so it's easy to point at a random person or general system and claim that they are at fault for the disparity so long as that's within the streetlight scope. That's the dangerous difference here between the streetlight of equity and the streetlight of the drunkard stumbling around for his keys. Because it's impossible to disprove in the former case, social justice has become the grift that keeps on giving. Like for instance, here's another example. Let's say it is entirely discrimination, but you don't really know if it's within the streetlight or not. Like going back to the school where it's a 25 even split. Let's pretend that it really is the school and the faculty that's being prejudiced here, with the net result of the discrimination being that the red students are less likely to graduate. Okay, well, what's going to follow is a secondary effect from that being that red students are going to have a harder time finding a job. And let's say that some bureaucrat is only looking at those statistics, and they see that red people are disproportionately less likely to get hired by businesses in their city. And so once again, instead of a serious good faith investigation into the root cause, they conclude that the businesses in their area are being prejudiced against red people. Again, following the streetlight effect. They're just making that conclusion because that's what the data they see in front of their face says. And they just stupidly assume that that data is all there is to the universe. I mean, it is actually insane when you realize just how common this cognitive bias is, especially again when combined with the unfalsifiable nature of the accusation to begin with. It's easy for them to do, and it's very difficult to prove them wrong, and so the midwits can't freaking help themselves. And unless they want JD freaking Vance for 2028, they're gonna have to start seriously thinking about this. Because aside from whatever the root cause may be, a big part of the solution, in my opinion, is that we really just need to return to valuing liberty over equality. A big part of the issue at hand really just starts from the fact that neoliberals promised equal outcomes to begin with. But that's a ridiculous promise. Because as many others on the libertarian right have pointed out, we aren't even able to correctly identify the cause and root out the reasons of inequalities in the scope of an immediate family. Even two siblings, twins even, raised in the same family in roughly the same scenario under the same socioeconomic status, do not have equal outcomes in life. And the reasons behind why that is are deeply complicated. And so that's actually the biggest problem with the equity fallacy. Even when they are correct in the base assumption that an inequality is due to some kind of injustice, it's still an oversimplification. And if the liberals really want to fix it, seriously want to have a good faith attempt at actually fixing it, then they need to sober the heck up and stop looking for solutions under the streetlight. Anyways, that's all I have to say. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe, and yeah, hit the little bell. Apparently you have to do that now. And if you really like my content, you can support me on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or by buying some merch. Which, I didn't really have a sponsor for this video. I didn't really put anything on sale for the merch store, but I will just let you know that there is a merch sale going on, or the gamer-related merch. But yeah, thanks again. That is all. Till next time.